Hey guys, welcome back. So in today's video, we will be talking about the most important state management library that React and React Native developers use for state management. So without wasting any time, let's see the agenda for today's video. So today we are going to understand first question, which is what is Redux? Why we should use Redux in our application? What are the major components of Redux? What is Redux Saga and how we can use Redux Saga with Redux? And in the last, I am going to show you a working example of a contact app with source code. I'll provide the link of the GitHub repository in the description so that you can check out that code and you can understand Redux very well. So without wasting any time, let's see the first question. What is Redux? So many of us is confused of what is Redux. So Redux is nothing but a state management library. Redux is what? Redux is state management library. And it is for JavaScript applications. It is for JavaScript application. Okay, so why I'm saying it's JavaScript application, because we can use Redux with React, we can use it with Angular, we can use it with Vue, and any other framework or library. We can use Redux for state management. Okay, so it is not specific that Redux is only for React or Angular or Vue. We can use it with any library. It is compatible with any library or framework. Okay, so you understood what is Redux. Redux is a state management library for JavaScript application. Okay, now let's understand what do you mean by state management. Okay, so state management is nothing but, for example, you have a component. Let's say you have a class-based component, and inside this you have a state. You have a state, this dot state, and inside this you have a object and you have a name, let's say Vinith. Okay, so this state is available to only this component, right? Only this component. This state is available for this component only. So what if I want to pass this name from this component? So let's say I have one more component and I have same class based, and I have to pass this name from this component to this component. I have to pass this name to this component, right? So for that we will be going to use props, right? We will be going to use props, right? So we can pass the data inside the props and we can get the data from the props. Okay, this approach is okay when you have less number of components. Let's say you have 5 to 10 components. This approach is perfectly all right, right? But what if you have a large component hierarchy? So let's say you have a component and that component has some more components, and that components have some more components, and so on, right? So there are a large number of components in your application and you have to pass data from one component. So let's say you have a name here and you have to pass this name from this component to, let's say, this component. So what you are going to do is you have to put this component to this and to this and to this, and then you have to pass it to this, and then you have to pass it to this. So this concept is called as props drilling. This concept is called as props drilling, where you have to pass your data from props. But this is really difficult if you have thousands or hundreds of components inside your project. So this is very difficult. If you want to pass, suppose, first component to the 99th component, then how will you pass data from the first component to this component, which is very far from each other? So at that particular time, Redux comes into picture. So what Redux do is, Redux provide you a central hub, or you can say a central repository where you can keep your data, and that is called as store. That is called as store. So you can keep the data of entire application inside your store, and you can fetch the data from the store whenever you want. So this is why we use Redux as a state management library, because it basically gives you a central repository to store your data, and that repository is called as a store. Okay, so you understood what is Redux. Redux is a state management library used for JavaScript application. What do you mean by state management? Is like if you have a component and that component state is specifically for that component, and if you want to pass that data from one component to another component, you have to use props. But you can use props for 5 to 10 components. But what if you have a large application and you want your data to be stored in the central repository? At that particular time, Redux comes into picture. Okay, so we'll understand the major components of Redux. Okay, so let's jump into that. Okay, so Redux basically have three major components. First is called as action. Second is called as reducer, and the third one is called as store. Okay, so how Redux works is it dispatches an action. Okay, we can dispatch an action and that action is been captured by the reducer, and the reducer changes the state and it gives it to the store. Okay, so what happens is, like, action basically has two things. One is a type and second is the payload. So whenever we dispatch an action, it has two things, type and payload. Like which type of action you want to trigger and with which data, with what data you have to pass. You can give it in the payload. Okay, so once an action is dispatched, it goes to the reducer. So what is the duty of reducer? It takes the previous state, and action which you have dispatched, and it gives you the new state, and it gives you a new, which is the updated state. Okay, and once you got the new state, you put it inside the store. Okay, and whenever you want to get that data, you can get it from the store. This is the basic funda of Redux. Okay, so the major thing is you have to understand the flow. So what is the flow? Whenever you have a component, let's say you have a component and you dispatch an action, from that particular component. So what happens is, whenever you dispatch an action basically have two things, type and payload. Okay, type and payload. Payload is nothing but the data you have passed to that particular action, and type is which type of action you want to trigger. Once this type and payload is triggered as an action, it goes to the reducer. So what reducer does is it takes the previous state, and the action you have triggered, and based on the action it provides you with the new state, and that new state is been stored in the store. Okay, and after this cycle you can again go back to your component and you can get your data from either get state or use selector hook. Get state method or use selector hook. Okay, so this is the basic fundamental of Redux. So I hope you understand what Redux is and what are the three major components of Redux. Okay, so these are the three major components. One is the action, second is the reducer, and third one is a store. Okay, now you will be thinking, okay, these three are the major components, then why we are going to use Redux Saga in it, right? So let's check the fourth question, which is what is Redux Saga? Redux Saga. So Redux Saga is nothing but it is a middleware. It is a middleware. Okay. So what do you mean by middleware? Middleware is basically used for creating an asynchronous calls. Okay. What do you mean by that? So let's see with the example. So whenever you dispatch an action, okay, so the action is dispatched. So action basically have type and payload, right? It has a type and payload. Okay. Instead of directly going to the reducer, we will keep an eye off on the action using the Redux Saga. Okay. So what happens is like it acts as a middleware. It takes the action which you have triggered as a middleware, okay, and it tells that okay, this action is being dispatched. So before going into the reducer, you can call your APIs. You can call your API as an asynchronous task, and you can call the API, and whatever data is returned to the API, you can give it to the reducer. Okay, so what is the job of reducer? You know that, right? You can simply take the previous state and action, and you can give the new state to the store. Okay, so the functionality of Redux Saga is basically to capture the action and to do an asynchronous task. Okay, so I hope you understood what is Redux Saga. So let me explain you once again. Action goes to the reducer, but instead of directly going to the reducer, there is a middleware watching whether the action is being dispatched or not. Redux Saga basically is used for API calls, and once the API has given the response, then it will call the reducer. The reducer will call the store again. So this is the basic concept of Redux and Redux Saga. Okay, so I hope you understood the concept. So let me summarize you. So what is Redux? Redux is a state management library for JavaScript application. Okay, then why use Redux? Is because we have to pass data from props, but if you have a bigger application, it is very difficult to pass data from one component to another component. Hence we use Redux to basically keep all the data inside a store, which is the central repository. Okay, the third question which we learned is the major components. So the components basically it has basic three component: action, reducer, and store. Okay, then we learned about Redux Saga. So what is Redux Saga? Redux Saga is a middleware which keeps an eye of on an action, and it is used for the asynchronous calls. Okay, so this way you can simply write your code if you understood these things. Okay, so this is what Redux is all about. Okay, so for using Redux, you have to take two libraries. First is npm. You have to install Redux, and you have to install Redux Saga to use these two things. Okay, so there is a lot of boilerplate code that you have to do before using Redux and Redux Saga. Boilerplate code. Okay, so a lot of people think that Redux is very boring because of this boilerplate code. But once you done the boilerplate code, then it is really simple to use Redux and Redux Saga. Okay. The next thing which I have to tell you is like you have to wrap your component, which is a root component. You have to wrap your root component in the provider, and provider takes basically one thing which is called as a store. Okay, so provider will provide the store to the root component. Okay, and you have to pass a store to it. Okay, and the second thing I have to tell is you have to write root reducers and root saga, which is a combination of all the reducers and all the sagas actions. Okay, so once we jump into the code, you'll understand this better. Okay, so I have created a small application of contact app. Okay, so what it basically does is calls the API. So I have used two APIs. Okay, one is for getting the users and second for getting the photos. Okay, and I have used JsonPlaceholder API, which is a fake API available, and it basically shows a list of contacts with the name, phone number, and the photo. And once you click on this, it goes to a details page where it will show the photo, name, and email ID, website, and all that stuff. Okay, so this data we are storing it inside the Redux store. Redux store. Okay, so first let me show you which API I am going to use for our application. So the API which we are using is a JSON placeholder API, where slash users, if you call, it will basically gives you a list of users. Okay, so if you'll see list of user as name, username, email ID, address, phone number, website, company, but it doesn't have a photo. If you have to display a photo as well, so for that I'm using a different API, which is the photos API. Okay, so in this you will get the URL of the particular ID's photo. Okay, so I will be calling these two APIs and I will be storing the data inside the Redux store. Okay, and for the details screen, what we have to do is basically, for example, he clicked on the first user, you have to pass the ID of that user in the URL. So once you pass, you will get all the data of that particular user itself. Okay, so without wasting any time, let's jump and let's see how the application looks like. So this is how the application looks like. So once I open the application, there is a loader and then we are showing a list of users. So one API I'm calling for users and the second one I'm calling for the photos. Once I click on a particular user, it shows the details of the particular user using the same API users with the ID. And once if I want to delete that contact, I can delete that contact and that contact will be deleted from the Redux store and from the list as well. So let's see how the code is been written for this particular application. Okay, so I have created three folders. One is the components folder for small components, one is the screen folder, and second one is a Redux folder. So in the Redux folder, if you'll see, I have action, reducers, saga, and I have created one folder for API calling. Okay, so you have to create action, which is a major component, then the reducer, which is another major component, and there is a sagas for saga calling, which internally calls the API. Okay, so like for the boilerplate code, what I have done is basically I have wrapped my app component inside the provider. So provider is coming from the React Redux library. Okay, so I have done like from the app, which is the root component, I have wrapped it inside the provider, and provider will take basically a store as an argument. So I have created a store. Okay, so let's see how the store.js looks like. So the store.js look like this. So for creating the store, what you have to do is basically you have to use the create store from the Redux. create store, and then you have to pass some parameters to the create store. So first is the root reducer, which we have created, root reducer. And the second one is, if you want to apply any middleware, you have to use apply middleware from Redux, and then you have to pass the middleware instance. So for this, I have used a create Saga middleware function, which basically gives you a Saga middleware instance, which you can pass it to the apply middleware, and you can use that Saga middleware and run with the root Saga. So I've created a root Saga and a root reducer. Okay. So why a root Saga and root reducer is required? Because all the sagas and the reducer should be present inside the root. Otherwise, it won't work. Okay. So in the store, what we have done, we have used a create store which needs a root reducer and a Saga middleware instance, which we have created from the create Saga middleware, and I am running that in and passing the root Saga. So first, let's see root Saga. So in the root Saga, what I have done, I have used a yield spawn. So spawn means basically whenever this particular saga, any instance of this particular saga is been triggered, then it will basically call based on the actions we have used. Okay, so these are the actions we have used. Okay, so root Saga, you have to give the root file of the saga, which I have created it like this, and you can write all your functions of the saga inside this particular file. Okay, and the next is the root reducer. Well, you will be have to pass all the reducers file. So I have created these reducers and I have kept it in the root reducer. Okay, so these are the basic boilerplate things that you have to do. Okay, the major functionality comes when you create the screens. So there are two screens. One is a home screen, which is this one, and once you click on a particular, there is a detail screen, which is this one. So let's go to the home screen. Okay, so what I'm doing in the home screen is, in the use effect hook, I am dispatching an action. Okay, so the action I have created inside the actions folder. Okay, what I told is you have to dispatch an action, right? So this action, I have created it inside the action folder, fetch contact data. Okay, so what fetch contact data do is, it basically triggers an action. So I have created a types file. Inside that, I have kept all my actions. In the types file, I have kept all my actions. This is a good practice basically to keep your actions in one particular file. So for getting the users data, I have created a send request get all users. Then for success and for failure, I have created two different actions. Okay, so whenever this action is being dispatched, okay, you have a type and a payload. You have a type and payload. Okay, so type is nothing but which actions you want to dispatch. So I have told that you have to dispatch this action, which is a send request get all user. Okay, and payload is the data. If you want to pass any data, you can pass it here, but I have given a empty object because I don't need to pass any data to the API, because the users API is basically giving you data without any parameter passing, right? You have to just call /users and all the data will be available. So once an action is dispatched, it has a type and a payload. Okay, so if payload is nothing, you can pass it as an empty object. Once this action is being dispatched, it goes to the saga. It goes to the saga, and where I have created, whenever an action is dispatched with this action name, which is send request get all user, you just take that action, and before calling the reducer, you call this get user method. So I've created this get user method in this file itself. Okay, so what is basically, this is a generator function. This is nothing but a generator function. Okay, so we'll not talk more about generator function, but basically generator function is same kind of function only, but we can pause and start whenever is required. So we can pause once the API is getting called, and we can resume once we get the data back. So that is the major functionality of generator functions. So what I have done is I have called the API get all users. So I created this function get all user, and I am using axios.get to call the users API. Okay, and I have kept a limit of 10. So only 10 records will be given, and I am returning the users.data. So I'm whatever data I'm getting from the API, I am returning that to the Saga. Okay, and what happens is once you get the user back from this API, which is the data, then you are calling a success action, and you are passing that user to that payload. So we are calling another action with a payload as user. Okay, but if you didn't got any data and if there any failure, then it goes to the catch block and it calls a failure action with an payload as an error which we have got from the API. Okay, so like this you can call your success and failure, and you can pass your payload here. Okay, so once this, for example, the API has got success and you got the user.data, and you have successfully called this success, which is the send request get all user success method action you have called. Once this action is called, it basically goes to the reducer, and inside this reducer, what reducer does is it basically takes the previous state and action. This is the action. So if there is a success action being triggered, what you have to do, it takes the previous state and the action triggered, and it returns the new state, right? And the new state is the user object which we have got from the API. Okay, so what I have done is basically I have created an initial state. So initial state basically has three things. One is the loading, like if the API is getting called, you have to keep the loading to true, otherwise it will be false. And a user array which will be going to store this particular array. Okay, and if there is any error, it will be going to store in this object. So I'm passing this initial state to the reducer. So reducer is nothing but it takes the initial state and action. It takes the state which is currently an initial state before it is triggered any action, and it has a action which has type and payload. So based on the action triggered, so for example, we are triggering an action send request get all user. It means we are calling the API. At that particular time, I have to put the loading as true. That's it, nothing else. If the API has given success, then you have to call, you have called this action, and whenever this action is called, take the previous state from the dot 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 operator, which is a spread operator, and put the payload, whatever the user data you have got, put that payload inside the user object. And if you have got any error, then you have to basically pass the user as nothing and error as whatever payload you have got from the API. So this is a basic functionality where you dispatch an action and the action has type and payload. Okay, and whatever type is being dispatched, it takes by the user sagas, and the saga will take that particular action and it will call a generator function, and that generator function will call the API for us, which is this API, Axios API, and it returns the user data. The user data is being given to this, and once you got a user data properly, you can trigger a success action and with the payload as user. Otherwise you can give a failure action with a error as a payload. And once this action has been dispatched, it goes to the reducer, and in the reducer what it is done is whenever these actions are dispatched, we are basically changing the state. So once the API is called, we are changing the loading to true. That's it. But if we have got a success, we will have a payload with the user object. We are storing it inside the user, and we are passing loading to false. If there is any failure, we put the loading to false and user as an empty thing and error as a whatever payload we have got from the error in the API. Okay, so this is how a basic functionality works. So for photos also same thing. So for the photo, I'm dispatching an action called as fetch data, photo data, and inside this fetch photo data, I am calling this get all photos action, which is this one. Okay, and it has a type and a payload. Okay, which is currently empty because the photo array also gives without any data. And once this action is dispatched, it goes to the Saga, and here in the root Saga you will see the contact Saga, where you will see whenever an action is dispatched with this name, call get photos function, which is a generator function, and that generator function basically calls the API for you, which is get all photos I have created, and it will call the API and it will give you the photos data and it will give you back. And once this is back, you call the success and failure based on the API, and you pass the payload as whatever you have got from the API. And then you will call the reducer, where you will store your photos in whatever you have got the payload from the API, and you will put the loading to false. So this is how a basic functionality works. Okay, so action has type and payload. Whatever type you have dispatched, it goes to the Saga. The Saga basically takes that action and calls a generator function. That generator function basically calls the API, and if the API is success or a failure, based on that will trigger another action, and that another action will basically change the state in the reducer. So in the reducer, if you have got the user, if you have got the photos, you can put it inside the photos array. Otherwise you can put it inside the error, whatever error you have got. Okay, so this is how the basic Redux functionality is. Okay, and whenever that basic store is being passed the data, you can take that data from a use selector hook. You can use a use selector hook. Okay, so use selector is basically takes the state, and from the state, if you want a user object, you can call that particular reducer, and then you can call that particular object. So in the contact reducer, if you'll see, there is a user which we have stored as a success parameter. So I am going to the contact reducer and I am saying that, okay, from the contact reducer, give me the user object. So the users will be given to us. The same way for the photos also, go to the photo reducer and call the photo object and return it inside the photos. The same way, if you want a loading, you can basically call the reducer and you can take the loading parameter from the reducer. Okay, and once you got the users photos and loading from the state, what you can do in the JSX is you can render. If loading is going on, then you can basically show an activity indicator that we am showing. But if loading is finished, what I am doing, I am basically mapping the photos and the users using the map function. Okay, so what map function do is it takes one particular photo from the object, and then it from that I'm fetching the URL of that particular user and I'm showing that, and then inside the user I'm taking one particular user and I'm showing the name of the user and the phone number of the user. So if you'll see the application looks like, first is the user and the phone number, which is getting displayed from here, user.name and user.phone, and the photo is being displayed from this image, which is the photo.url. So I'm using a map to map these two objects, photos and users arrays, which I have got from the store. These three things I have got from the store, from the state, and I am calling the reducer and getting the particular objects from that. So this is basically how the Redux works. Okay, So if you want to debug the application, you have to use a React Native debugger to better understand how the Redux states is working. Okay, so let's see that. So this is the React Native debugger which I have got. You can download this or you can add it as a Chrome extension. I have downloaded this, basically an exe file, and I'm using this React Native debugger. Okay, so to connect your application to your React Native debugger, what you have to do is you have to basically shake your phone and you got the debug option. Once you click on the debug option, you will be able to see the connection being done on the phone and the, so let me keep it this. Okay, so see, the data has been loaded and you will be able to see the user's object and the photos object inside the reducer. Okay, so I have stored the user's object in the contact reducer. So in the contact reducer you will be able to see user. Inside this you will be able to see all the JSON objects which is coming from the API, right? So this is a contact reducer and this is a photo reducer where all the photos is being stored. Okay, so I have given a limit of 10, that's why only 10 records is being fetched from the API and it has been showed. Okay, so this is how the data is being stored in the state. Okay, and if you'll see the actions, the first action which got dispatched is basically the get all users. Okay, the first API action. In that, the loading basically went to true. The contact reducer loading went to true, and for the second one the loading of the photo reducer went to true. Okay, once I get the user and the photo data, what I have done is basically whenever a success action is called, I am passing the user in the payload, right? So it is getting stored in the user object. Okay, and in the photos it is stored in the photos object. Okay, so if you remove the application from the background, all the state is vanished. Okay, all the state is vanished. So once I open this particular application, you will see the state changes. See, so I open this application and it is connected to the debugger, and see the data is being loaded and the data is here, and you will see the state again. The state has the photos reducer and the contact reducer with all the data inside that user reducer and in the photos. Okay, the same thing I am doing it in the details one also. Okay, so what happens is, like once I click on a particular user, let's say I click on Lynette Graham. Okay, so what happens is it basically calls the details one. Okay, so the action which is dispatched here is this one. Again, the user with an ID of 1, with an ID of 1. So ID I am fetching from the list and I am passing it to the payload. Okay, so once this user action and the photo action is being dispatched with ID is equal to 1, once success comes, it gives me basically the state which is the details reducer, and inside this I have one particular reducer, one particular ID 1, which is the Leon Graham, right? And all the data related to it. Okay, and for the photos also I have all the data related to it, right? So this is how the base in the photos reducer you'll get the photos with the URL, right? So this is how I created the detail screen. So let me show you the detail screen as well, which is this one. So in the detail screen, what happens is I dispatch two actions. Basically, first one is the fetch details action and the second one is the fetch photo data. So once the details action is being called, it is basically passing a payload, right? And the payload is what? The ID which I am getting from the list of screens, right? And I'm passing that payload to the action. So once this action is dispatched with the data, it basically goes to the Saga, and the Saga basically checks whether what I have to do whenever this action is being dispatched. So once this action is being dispatched, I go to the get details function, and inside this basically you call the API get details for the user and you pass the payload, right? So you pass the payload, which is basically the payload.id. You have to pass the ID to the users, and whatever data you got, you get it back from the um, that particular action. And once you get the user, you basically trigger a success action with the payload as user, or you trigger a failure action based on the error you have got. So once this success action is being triggered, it basically goes to the reducer, details reducer I have created, and inside this you will see the user is not an array now, it is an object, because it basically gives you an object instead of the array. So if you call the users, it will give you an array, but if you will call user slash let's say 1 as an ID, it will basically give you an JSON object. Okay, so like that, basically I have created this details reducer which takes the initial state, which is loading, user and error, and based on the action it performs, it takes the copy of the state and it just makes loading as true when the API is getting called. Once it is success, it basically takes the user from the payload and put the loading as false, and if it is a failure, it puts the error as in the payload. Okay, so this is how basically the details screen, which is this one, looks like. Okay, and the last thing I have to show is the delete functionality. Okay, so if I click on the delete button, it basically deletes that particular contact, so that contact is being gone. So how I am doing this is, in the details screen, what I have done is, in the details screen, I have a details info and a details header components. So in the details info, what I have done is, there is a delete button. There is a delete button which is called as a delete contact. Okay, on press of this delete, I am calling the delete contact function. So what this delete contact do is basically it takes the ID of that particular user, okay, and it calls basically to delete user from store action and delete the photo of that particular user. So two action is being dispatched. One is a delete user from store and second is delete photo from store. So if I'll see the delete user from store, it basically calls this action delete data from store and it passes the ID. Okay, so this is the action I am delete data from store action I am basically getting triggered. Okay, so once I have written, whenever this action is dispatched, what I have to do is basically you have to filter that particular array, and you have to remove that particular ID from the payload. So I am checking whatever ID is coming. If that ID is not equal to the payload, then okay, you keep it inside, otherwise you remove, you filter it out from the array. So what it does is, like, we have passed the payload ID as 1. So whenever 1 is equal to 1, it will filter that out, and which is not equal, which is 2, 1 is not equal to 1, 3 is not equal to 1, like that it will not remove, and it will give you the filter list of item inside the user. This app works. So I hope you understand what is a Redux and what is Redux Saga and how we call the APIs and pass data to the reducer and store, how we create a store, and we basically use that particular things to basically create our application and maintain our state. Okay, so if you have any doubts, you can post inside the comment box and I'll try to reply that, and I'll give you the GitHub repository of this particular code. Okay, so I'll show you the GitHub repository and I'll give you the link of that in the description so that you can download and you can basically take this code and try to run it and understand the flow of Redux and Redux Saga. So thank you for watching and have a nice day.